Hello, I'm Jimena Blanco. I head the Americas Politics Research Team at Verisk Maplecroft, and I'm here with my colleague Paul to talk to you about the first 100 days of Donald Trump in office.
My name is Paul McConnell. I'm Research Director at Mackenzie. So Jimena, 100 days of Donald Trump, a lot of noise, a very vocal election campaign. And now, what do we see? What do we see after the first 100 days?
Well, I think the main takeaway from our research is that, as you said, we were expecting huge change, not just domestically, but in the global risk landscape. And that really hasn't happened in the first 100 days. In fact, the geopolitical risk has barely shifted during this landmark time.
And why do you think that is? I mean, from my point of view as an energy analyst, there's a lot of talk prior to the election about, ending the war on coal, bringing back coal jobs, making America energy independent, these kinds of things. Now, there has been some changes, but really what's been done on the domestic front has really failed to add up to those campaign promises.
I think one of the key points is to separate between the realities of running a campaign and the realities of governing a country, especially a well-established, strong, democratic republic like the United States. And what we have seen in our research is that a lot of President Trump's domestic policies have stalled, largely because of the strength of US institutions, be it through the judiciary or through Congress. And that has really forced the White House administration to turn its focus to the foreign policy realm rather than looking inwards, as was promised during the campaign.
Mm-hmm. Certainly from an energy point of view, I think, I mentioned coal. We've seen a rollback on some of the Obama-era policies, a rollback on the Clean Power Plan. We no longer think that's going to be very relevant, but it's actually the economics, the fundamental economics of what's going on the ground, cheap gas, cheap renewables, and slowing electricity demand growth that are actually keeping a cap on the space for those for fossil fuels to grow in general and coal in particular. Now, I wonder from a kind of a risk point of view, are we seeing similar trends where the administration is actually constrained by the realities of the world around it rather than its ability to kind of perform radical change?
Absolutely. Our research shows that when we're looking at environmental and social risk and the liberalization, for example, of areas for exploration and development relating to national parks or even Native American lands, we see that the economics, again, really will determine where companies are able to go or decide to go, and that there is actually a very small overlap between coal and oil and gas deposits and national parks, and that the decision really of allowing companies to go into protected areas really lies with the states and not the federal administration. So a lot of the reforms that we have been talking about in terms of environmental and social risk might not be as impactful as some activist groups or some concerned citizens are thinking they would be.
Mm-hmm. And from a demand point of view, we've seen things like CAFE standards for corporate fuel efficiency standards have come back under review, and that means that potentially US oil demand could grow if those things are scaled back. But again, there are wider trends at work. We've got an auto industry globally which is facing the threat from electric vehicles. We've got within the US itself, as you mentioned, states have their own priorities. California has its own fuel efficiency standards, which automakers are likely to want to follow regardless of what happens at a federal level. So we do definitely see that sort of tension there, and the administration's sort of difficulty in forcing change.
Yes, and one area where the US domestic energy policy may impact the geopolitical arena is actually on whether production levels will maintain the oil price low, mm-hmm. and therefore put many Middle Eastern oil producing nations in a difficult fiscal position in terms of being able to stave off unrest by increasing or maintaining their social spending and the welfare states that they have created.
Yeah, I think it's a very interesting dynamic, because as we've almost in conjunction, or at least at this similar sort of time where Trump was elected, we had OPEC start to rein in production, prices a little bit boosted, but one of the main impacts that's had, or one of the main outcomes, is we've seen US domestic oil production continually grow, and that's helped keep a lid on any price increases. So you do have that very interesting tension there between US domestic production and what's happening in the Middle East, and then the impact on price.
Absolutely. Another key area where we see some risk of government instability going forward, and it's not directly linked to the US energy policy, but this does tie in, is in emerging markets that are highly reliant on dollar remittances to meet their debt commitments. One example of this would be Venezuela, that we have seen time and time again be able to meet its debt repayments, but with an economic, social and political crisis that is deepening very quickly. And in that front, the US Federal Reserve policy will have a huge implication on emerging markets' ability to borrow and be able to continue fueling growth in those economies.
I guess another area where emerging markets are kind of front and center is with the attitude to climate change and things like the Paris Agreement. So again, a lot of talk pre-election about tearing up the Paris Agreement, removing US participation from that. And there's certainly different points of view within the administration. Should the US stay or should it go? Now, at the moment, there has been, it's not clear which way the administration will jump. But I think, again, that reflects that some of the more difficult policy decisions have yet to be made within this first 100-day period.
I absolutely agree. And for Verisk Maplecroft, this is one of those areas where we can really see the tensions within the administration at play, but also tensions with other institutions within the United States, and especially with Congress, and how any significant reform going forward will be very slow in terms of pace, and we might not see huge departures from the previous administration's policies in the short term.
Mm-hmm. I guess you almost have a reversal of what we had with the Obama administration, where President Obama found it very difficult to pass laws because of a block in Congress, and now we have the same Democrats very unwilling to work with Trump. We see that with the decision to push the wall back just in the last couple of days, and maybe even a block of moderate Republicans who are less willing to force through some of the more difficult environmental
Absolutely.
changes.
And I think the message is coming across in terms of a moderation of the White House being forced by these institutions, by political parties, even by, as you were saying, moderate allies, to adopt a much more pragmatic policy in terms of trade, for example. So we've seen that when it comes to the relationship with China and with Mexico, that the White House has really maintained a moderate stance and hasn't gone down the path of, for example, tearing up trade accords or reshaping entirely the relationship with China. And that's a trend that we expect will continue during the course of this year.
Mm-hmm. So I guess one of the more striking things that has happened in the last 100 days is some of the foreign policy excursions, if you like. We've had airstrikes in Syria, we've had a bit more saber rattling around North Korea. Probably that wasn't really expected, I don't think.
For us, that's one of the key areas to continue watching as the administration unfolds. And one of the reasons for this is that the White House has really adopted a very flexible and at times unpredictable foreign policy. In fact, you could argue we're seeing a foreign policy that's more like the foreign policy of Russia and President Putin, that is using this idea of keeping rivals on the back foot with uncertainty as to what may be the government's next step. And it's really interesting to see the reaction between the relationship with European allies versus the relationship with other governments that we may describe as traditional rivals. So our analysis of negative exchanges between government officials show that there's been more negative exchanges between the United States and traditional European allies like Germany or the United Kingdom than there have been between the United States and rivals like Iran or China. In fact, with those two particular cases, the relationship has remained fairly stable, and we see a continuation from how the relationship was under the Obama administration.
So, Jimena, what can we expect from the next 100 days and even beyond that for the rest of the presidency?
Well, if we take the first 100 days as an indication, our view is that we can expect a lot more moderation and pragmatism going forward. One of the key areas, of course, that we will have to continue monitoring is the Korean Peninsula and how the tensions with North Korea develop. Though we do expect there that China and the maintenance of a strong relationship between the United States and China will translate into the imposition of sanctions and tightening more the relationship with North Korea, but not necessarily a full escalation into an armed conflict. And I think that's another area to watch in terms of a geopolitical risk, the relationship of the United States and Europe, and how Russia may react to tensions on the Korean Peninsula and what's apparently a United States decision to move a bit away from NATO. And this could result in Russia deciding to test the US's resolve in terms of supporting its NATO partners and challenging NATO going from the Balkans to the Mediterranean. And finally, a third area to watch is the development of commercial relations with Mexico particularly, and the changes that the White House wants to make to NAFTA in the second half of 2017. At the moment, the relationship remains unchanged, and so Mexico could have another record-breaking export year to the United States, but this is something we'll have to continue monitoring and visit at the end of the year.